Imagine it's July 1943, the Kursk salient. Inside a German Tiger, the crew feels almost invulnerable. 80 tons of the finest Krupp steel, a most powerful gun, Zeiss optics. They are the kings of the battlefield. Around them, like tin cans, Soviet tanks burn. The tank commander, an experienced non-commissioned officer, searches for the next target through the triplex. There it is, a T-34, a classic model with a 76mm gun. Easy prey. The German gunner catches it in the crosshairs. Distance about 800 m. The perfect range for the Tiger. Mortal for the T-34. The Soviet tank jerks. Flame erupts from its short barrel. The German crew doesn't even flinch. They've seen hundreds of times how Soviet blanks simply bounce off their frontal armor, leaving only scratches in the paint. It sounded like peas hitting a steel wall. But this time everything was different. Instead of the usual muffled bong that meant a ricochet, there was a dry, sharp crack like the strike of a whip. Something small, almost invisible, pierced the 100mm armor of the turret like a needle, a shred of fabric. Inside the Tiger, for a fraction of a second, it was as bright as day. Scalding sprays of metal and tungsten fanned out through the fighting compartment, turning everything into a fiery hell. The crew died instantly, never understanding what had killed them. When later German repairmen and engineers examined the knocked-out tank, they were baffled. The entry hole was perfectly round and, surprisingly, small. No bigger than a coin. No torn edges. No signs of an explosion. As if someone had drilled through the armor with a gigantic drill. How could an outdated, in their view, T-34 with its weak gun punch a hole in the front of the Reich's best tank? German intelligence reported that the Soviets had no shells capable of such a thing. Official reports insisted on one thing. The 76mm F-30 gun was helpless against the Tiger's frontal armor. Was this a fluke? A lucky hit in a vision slit? Or had the Russians developed something new? Something secret that wasn't in any reference books? That tiny hole in the Tiger's armor was the beginning of a great mystery. The mystery of a forbidden shell that was kept silent for decades. A shell that should not have existed. To understand where this enigmatic ghost shell came from, we must go back a little to the harsh year of 1942. The euphoria from the early successes of the T-34, which the Germans had nicknamed the miracle tank, was gradually fading. German engineering thought did not stand still. They quickly learned lessons from the shock of '41. Modernized panzers appeared on the battlefields. For example, the Panzer IV, which received a new long-barreled gun. Its shells could now penetrate the T-34 at long distances, but that was only the beginning. Soviet intelligence brought alarming reports. In Germany, work was in full swing to create fundamentally new heavy tanks. Machines with such armor that standard ammunition from all Soviet guns would be simply powerless against. Put yourself in the place of a Soviet designer or military engineer of that time. You know the enemy is about to roll out more monsters onto the battlefield. Your industry, evacuated beyond the Urals, is working at the limit of its capacity. To quickly create and launch into mass production a new, more powerful tank or a new, more powerful gun, the task is almost impossible. It requires time, resources, retooling entire factories, and there is no time. The enemy is already at the gates of Stalingrad. An answer was needed, fast, cheap, and effective. A solution that would let the old proven gun of the T-304 catch a second wind and fight the new German beasts. What was needed was not a new gun, but a new shell for the old gun. The idea hung in the air. Engineers around the world experimented with ammunition that could increase armor penetration. But Soviet specialists needed not just a theoretical inquiry, they needed a miracle. A weapon that could be produced under conditions of total war, and that would give an ordinary tanker in a standard T-34 a chance against the latest German developments. The task seemed impossible. Standard armor-piercing shells, essentially steel slugs, had reached the limit of their capabilities. There was no way to increase their velocity. The propellant would not allow it. Making them tougher was also difficult. A fundamentally new approach was needed, and that approach was found in one of the rarest and most refractory metals on the planet. Let's look into the turret of an ordinary T-34 somewhere on the southern front in the winter of 1942. The crew are yesterday's tractor drivers, combine operators, factory workers. They love their machine. It is fast, maneuverable, reliable. But in battle with the new German tanks, they increasingly feel helpless. This is how a typical fight looked for them. The commander spots a German tank ahead. "Armor piercing on the fascist," he shouts. The loader, pouring with sweat, rams a heavy steel slug into the breech. It is a standard BR-350A shell, or its improved version BR-350B. The gunner catches the target in the sight, gently squeezes the trigger. Fire. The tank trembles. Everyone stares toward the enemy and sees a bouquet of sparks. The shell struck the sloped armor of the German panzer and, without penetrating, flew off to the side. A ricochet. That is the most hated word for a tanker. It means your shot was wasted. You have revealed yourself, and you have done no harm to the enemy. And now the return shot will be his. His long-barreled gun will most likely not miss or ricochet. A deadly game of cat and mouse begins. You must close the distance, get on the enemy's flank or rear, where the armor is thinner. And that is a huge risk. It means charging across open ground under fire, relying on speed and luck. Soviet tankers suffered heavy losses. In their letters and memoirs, they often wrote about shell hunger. But it wasn't the quantity of shells they lacked. There were plenty of them. It was about quality, about the shortage of ammunition capable of reliably defeating enemy equipment at medium combat ranges. The standard 76mm slug was good against armor 40 to 50mm thick. But when tanks with 80, even 100mm armor appeared on the battlefield, it became useless. Psychologically, it was very hard. To know that you have dozens of shells in your stowage, but none of them guarantees the destruction of the enemy. It undermined faith in your weapon and forced you to risk your life unnecessarily. The problem required an immediate solution, and that solution was born in the quiet of secret design bureaus, far from the roar of the front. So what did Soviet engineers come up with? The idea was brilliant in its simplicity and audacity. It was based on basic laws of physics. Imagine you want to break through a wall. What is more effective? Hitting it with a large soft pillow or with a thin steel crowbar, given the same force applied to the blow? The answer is obvious. Concentrating all the energy on a small area produces enormous pressure capable of piercing the barrier. Engineers decided to apply this same principle to a tank shell. What if, instead of a solid steel slug, they made a composite projectile? Take a light casing and place inside it a very small but incredibly heavy and strong core. When fired, the light projectile can be accelerated to a much higher velocity than a conventional heavy one. And when it strikes the armor, the light casing will disintegrate, while the small, heavy, ultra-high-speed core, like that crowbar, will continue by inertia and pierce the armor through. This idea became known as the subcaliber shell. Subcaliber because the diameter of its main damaging element, the core, was significantly smaller than the gun's caliber, and the role of that crowbar was to be performed by. One of the densest and hardest metals on Earth is tungsten. Tungsten is almost twice as dense as lead and rivals the hardest tool steels in hardness. A core of tungsten carbide, an alloy of tungsten with carbon, was the ideal candidate for the role of an armor killer. It did not melt on contact with armor and did not deform, preserving all its kinetic energy for penetration. The projectile design, given the GAU index 530-BR350P, was rather clever. It consisted of a tungsten core enclosed in a steel cup. Over that was fitted a light aluminum or steel jacket with a ballistic cap for better aerodynamics. Among the people, such shells were nicknamed spools because of their characteristic shape. At firing, the whole assembly flew toward the target. On impact, the light jacket crumpled, while the small but very heavy core, accelerated to enormous speed, continued on, piercing the steel. It was an elegant and deadly solution. It did not require changing the gun or the tank. It allowed the old T-34 gun to gain completely new, incredible capabilities. The development of the subcaliber shell was a real engineering thriller. The work was led by the talented designer Nikolai Romanovich Burmistrov. His team faced several extremely difficult tasks at once. The first and foremost, where to get tungsten. The Soviet Union had its own deposits before the war, for example the Chernoskoye in the Caucasus. But by 1942 the Caucasus was either occupied or in the front zone. Mining had practically stopped. Tungsten overnight became a strategic resource number one, its value comparable to gold or platinum. It was needed not only for shells. It was used for lamp filaments, welding electrodes, but most importantly for cutting tools for machine tools. Without tungsten cutters, the entire defense industry producing tanks, aircraft and guns would simply stop. Every gram of tungsten counted. Some came from Lend-Lease allies, but it was catastrophically little. Therefore, engineers had to perform literal miracles of economy, calculating the shape and size of the core so as to achieve maximum effect with minimum consumption of the precious metal. The second problem was accuracy. A projectile of unusual design behaved in flight differently from a conventional slug. The ideal shape of the jacket and ballistic cap had to be found so it would fly steadily and not tumble. Dozens of tests and wind tunnel runs were performed. The third task was the so-called spool device or cup. This part had to reliably guide the core through the barrel and then not interfere after leaving it. But sometimes it separated incorrectly and disturbed the flight trajectory. That too required long and painstaking experiments. Work proceeded under the strictest secrecy. All drawings, calculations, and test protocols were classified top secret of particular importance. Designers worked around the clock, sleeping right in the workshops. They understood that thousands of lives at the front depended on their success. This was not just a job, it was their personal battle with German tigers and panthers, a battle fought on drawing boards and test ranges. And they won that battle. By the end of 1942, the first experimental batches of the new shell were ready for tests. Why such strict secrecy? One might think a new weapon is a reason for pride and propaganda. They could have loudly proclaimed to the world that the Soviet Union had an answer to the German beasts. But the Stavka reasoned otherwise, and for several weighty reasons. First, as we have already said, tungsten was the Achilles heel of the whole project. If the Germans learned that the effectiveness of the new Soviet shell depended directly on that rare metal, they would do everything possible to cut off the remaining supply channels. They would intensify bombing of transport hubs, unleash submarine warfare against Lend-Lease convoys. Revealing the shell's secret would put the entire production program at risk. Second, the element of surprise. War is not only a clash of iron but a battle of minds, a battle of intelligence. Imagine the shock of German tankers and designers when their supposedly invulnerable tanks suddenly begin to be pierced by a gun they considered long obsolete. It would sow uncertainty, fear, and doubt in their superiority. The Germans would have to spend precious time and resources to figure out what was happening and to develop countermeasures. And in war, time is lives. Every month the secret remained undisclosed gave Soviet tank crews an advantage. Third, they did not want to reveal their cards prematurely. Mass production of subcaliber shells was impossible. There were very few of them. If their existence became widely known, it would raise unjustified expectations at the front. Soldiers would wait for a miracle weapon that would not be available in sufficient quantities. It was far more effective to use it selectively, like a surgeon's scalpel, at the most critical places and the most dangerous sectors where its application could yield the greatest tactical effect. Therefore, the project was classified at the highest level. Documents concerning the production and distribution of BR-350P were filed under the special folder stamp, access to which was granted to only a narrow circle within the State Defense Committee. Even at the front, many commanders did not know what exactly had been delivered to them in specially sealed crates. Instructions were oral and extremely terse. This is a special munition. Use only against heavy tanks. 1 or 2 per vehicle. Strict accounting. Thus the legend of the forbidden shell was born, a weapon that existed but of which almost no one knew. Finally, the day of decisive tests arrived. Trophy vehicles were brought to the proving ground near Moscow. Among them was one of the first Tigers captured intact. Opposite it, at a standard range, they set up an ordinary 76mm tank gun removed from a T-34. Senior officers from the main artillery directorate and representatives of the People's Commissariat of Armaments were present. The atmosphere was tense. First, they performed a control shot. They fired at the Tiger with a standard service armor-piercing round BR-350B. The shot sounded and everyone saw the now familiar scene. A spray of sparks and a small dent on the Tiger's frontal armor. The armor was not penetrated. That confirmed the worst fears. Then the loader picked up the unusual light shell that looked like a spool. In the ensuing silence, his movements seemed especially slow and ceremonial. He rammed the round into the breech. Fire! The command came. The shot sounded different, dry and crisp. Everyone watching held their breath. A moment later, a small neat hole appeared in the center of the Tiger's frontal plate, from which a thin wisp of smoke unfurled. The commission approached the tank. Incredible. 100 millimeters of armor, hardened by the best German techniques, had been pierced through. Looking inside through an open hatch, the engineers saw a horrific sight. The entire interior of the fighting compartment was lacerated by fragments. Melted pieces of metal protruded from the seats, from the instruments, from the walls. It was obvious that if there had been a crew inside, they would not have had the slightest chance. The tests were repeated several times from different distances and angles. The result was the same each time. Confident penetration. The subcaliber round worked. It truly turned the T-34's gun into a formidable anti-tank weapon capable of fighting the newest German designs. The test protocol lay on the desk of the country's highest leadership. The decision was made immediately to launch the round into serial production, but with one very important condition. Given the tungsten shortage and the need to preserve secrecy, production would be strictly limited. This shell would not become mass-produced. It would become a weapon for the chosen, a special tool to solve the most difficult tasks. The order was given. The machinery of the war industry began to slowly turn to produce the first top-secret batches of Tiger killers. So the round was adopted. But how to deliver this secret weapon to the front so that no one would suspect its existence? That was a separate special operation. BR-350P rounds were never supplied to the troops in the same way as ordinary ammunition. They were not loaded into wagons or sent to General Army depots. Each round was strictly accounted for. Production was concentrated at a few heavily guarded factories. Finished shells were packed into special wooden crates that bore no standard markings. Instead of the usual inscriptions like armor piercing or fragmentation, they bore code designations. These crates were transported under armed guard, often accompanied by NKVD officers. They were delivered not to every unit but by address, under special Stavka orders. First in line to receive them were Guards tank corps and armies operating on the most critical sectors of the front. Before major offensive or defensive operations where many German heavy tanks were expected, an elite unit received a special cargo. The commander of a tank brigade or regiment was ordered to accept several such crates. Issuance was made personally by the tank commander or even to gunners against signature. Often this took place at night under strict secrecy. Tank crews were issued only a few rounds per tank. Usually 2, rarely 3 or 4. This was an untouchable reserve. They were instructed to stow them in the fighting loadout in a strictly defined place so that in the heat of battle they could not be mistaken for ordinary shells. These few spools were the crew's last argument. They were forbidden to be spent on light targets, armored personnel carriers, artillery pieces, or medium tanks. The order was clear: use only against Tigers, Panthers, and the heavy Ferdinand self-propelled guns. Every shot with such a round had to be justified. Consumption was carefully controlled. After battle tankers had to report every spent special round, indicating the type of target and the result of the shot. The loss of such a round, for example in a knocked-out tank, was considered an extraordinary incident and required a separate investigation. Thus, BR-350P became a weapon not for everyone. It was a privilege of the best, most experienced and steadfast crews whom the motherland trusted with its most important secret in the fight against German armored vehicles. A logical question arises: how were tankers taught to use this new, unusual weapon? The answer may surprise you. Practically not at all. There were no mass courses, no special training chutes. Large-scale training would have revealed the secret completely. Imagine if tankers on every range began firing spools. The information would inevitably leak to the Germans. Therefore, training, like supply, was targeted and informal. Everything was built on oral instructions and personal experience. When a crew received its 2 or 3 precious rounds, the company or battalion commander, who himself had been briefed by a representative from Army headquarters, gave them instructions. The instruction was decidedly simple. Comrades, this is a new subcaliber round. You see, it's lighter and its shape is different. It flies much faster than the usual one, so you must use less lead when firing at a moving target. It is very accurate but loses power at long ranges. The most effective distance is up to 500 m. Remember, its task is to penetrate armor. It does not explode inside like a high-explosive fragmentation round. It pierces the tank through and hits the crew and equipment with searing fragments of armor and of the core itself. Therefore, aim at places where crew members sit, or where the ammunition is in the turret or the central part of the hull. And most importantly, do not waste it, only use it against Tigers and Ferdinands. Understood? That was the whole training. No complex ballistic tables, no abstruse lectures. A simple, clear instruction for a soldier at the front. The psychological effect of possessing such a weapon was enormous. A crew with those 2 spools in the fighting load felt much more confident. They were no longer punching bags. They had a chance, a real chance in a duel with a German heavyweight. It was like giving an infantryman armed with a rifle a couple of silver bullets against a werewolf. He still takes a risk, but now he has something to answer with. That confidence was worth dearly. It allowed crews to act more boldly, not afraid to go into frontal attacks, knowing that in the decisive moment they would have an argument in the barrel against which German armor was powerless. And what about the Germans? How did they react to the appearance of strange holes in the armor of their best tanks? At first, complete bewilderment. The first reports from the front, from Leningrad and Stalingrad, where the first Tigers appeared in late 42, early 43, caused only skepticism among German commanders and engineers. Strange descriptions began to appear more and more often in loss reports. Crews of knocked-out tanks who survived told of a sharp dry blow and the instantaneous death of comrades. Repair teams reported small, perfectly round holes in the thickest armor. Initial theories varied widely. They thought it might be the result of hits by aircraft cannons or fire from some new, superpowerful anti-tank artillery. The idea that this was the work of an ordinary T-34 tank gun was for a long time not taken seriously. German specialists were confident in their calculations. According to their tables, the 76mm shell could not penetrate the Tiger's 100mm frontal armor under any circumstances. So such cases were written off as statistical anomalies, for example, a hit in a weakened zone at the joint of armor plates or a defect in a particular armor plate. German intelligence, the Abwehr, was also silent. They had no data about a new Soviet munition. Agents operating in the Soviet rear reported nothing. Analysis of open sources like newspapers and radio broadcasts gave nothing either. The topic was completely closed. The situation began to change by the summer of 1943, before the Battle of Kursk. The number of Tigers and Panthers on the front increased sharply, but with it the number of cases of their mysterious destruction. When such reports began to arrive by the dozens, it became impossible to ignore them. German engineers started to study damaged vehicles seriously. They cut out pieces of armor with mysterious holes and sent them to laboratories in Germany. Chemical analysis of fragments lodged in the armor showed the presence of tungsten. That was the first key to the mystery. The Germans themselves were actively developing subcaliber shells with tungsten cores, the so-called Panzergranate 40. They knew the physics of the process well, but it was a complete surprise to them that the Soviet Union, which they considered technologically behind, had not only developed but also set up production of such a complex munition under the most severe conditions of war. The German command was in shock. The mystery of the little hole in the armor began to unravel. Let us try to reconstruct one of those engagements based on veterans' memories. Imagine a small village somewhere near Belgorod, in the height of the Kursk battle. Morning. 3 enormous silhouettes crawl out from a grove on the village edge. Tigers. They move slowly, unhidden, firing at Soviet positions. Panic begins in the trenches. Infantry can do nothing against these monsters. In an ambush inside a half-destroyed barn stands a lone T-34. Its commander, a young lieutenant, watches the Germans through binoculars. His task is to delay them at any cost, to allow the infantry to withdraw. He has only 2 subcaliber rounds in the fighting load. He understands he cannot afford a mistake. Load armor-piercing, he orders. They need to range first, determine distance. The tank shudders from the shot. The shell hits the frontal armor of the lead Tiger and bounces off. The Germans notice the muzzle flash. The Tiger's turret slowly turns toward the barn. The Soviet crew has seconds. Useless, the gunner shouts. It won't penetrate. Stay calm. The lieutenant replies. Load the spool, the subcaliber. The loader, nervous, takes the light, unusual shell from its special slot and rams it into the barrel with a clang. Ready, he shouts. The German tank is almost aiming its huge gun. Into the turret under the mantlet. Fire, commands the lieutenant. The gunner, an experienced sergeant, holds his breath and smoothly pulls the trigger. The shot. Everyone in the tank instinctively presses into their seats. They see a tiny fiery dot speeding toward the Tiger. There is no spray of sparks, no ricochet. Just a small black dot appears in the German tank's turret where the gunner had aimed. For a second nothing happens. Then thick black smoke pours from the Tiger's commander's cupola. Moments later the ammunition detonates. A huge explosion tears the German tank to pieces. The turret is blown several meters into the air. The 2 remaining Tigers, not understanding what has happened, stop. Their crews are in shock, wondering what is shooting them. That pause gives the Soviet tank precious time. The T-34 bursts from the barn at full speed, changing position. A second subcaliber is already in the barrel. The second shot freezes another Tiger, pierced through the side. The third German tank, not choosing to engage, hastily retreats. The T-34, thanks to just 2 special rounds, stopped the attack of an entire line of heavy tanks. This is not fiction. It is the reality of battles in which Soviet ingenuity and secret technology prevailed over German steel. Rumors about the new miracle shell began to spread on both sides of the front, accumulating the most incredible details. Among Soviet tankers, especially in guard units, BR-350P became a real legend. It was called by many names: the spool, the drill, the punch-through, the burner. Soldiers prone to mysticism believed it was some special, enchanted projectile. They told stories of a single round that pierced 2 German tanks lined up one behind another, or of one that entered a Tiger's barrel and tore it apart from the inside. Of course, these were tall tales, but they boosted morale. The knowledge that you possessed such a weapon inspired confidence. Crews carrying subcalibers were considered elite, lucky. Receiving them was a sign of special trust from the command. German rumors were of a completely different, grim and worrying nature. They did not know what this weapon was, and that bred fear. The unknown frightens more than the real threat. German tank crews, long accustomed to feeling safe behind thick armor, suddenly realized their fortress could be breached at any moment. They began scanning the battlefield more cautiously, fearing T-34 ambushes. Some even started hanging spare tracks or sandbags on their armor, hoping it might offer extra protection. Of course, against a tungsten core that did nothing, but psychologically it made them feel slightly safer. German propaganda tried to fight these rumors. Officially, it was claimed that every instance of a Tiger being penetrated was the result of heavy artillery fire or ground attack aircraft. But soldiers at the front saw things with their own eyes and trusted not orders, but what their surviving comrades told them. These spreading rumors were just as powerful a factor as the real damage caused by the shells themselves. They eroded enemy confidence, sowed doubt and fear. The small subcaliber shell was waging its own psychological war, and in that war, too, it scored victories. It turned the T-34 from easy prey into a deadly predator, a hunter of Tigers. And the German tank crews felt that very clearly. The Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943 became the BR-350P shell's moment of glory. It was here, on the fields near Prokhorovka and Aboyan, that it saw its true baptism of fire. The Germans threw hundreds of their newest tanks into battle: Tigers, Panthers, and heavy Ferdinand tank destroyers with their supposedly impenetrable frontal armor. They hoped to smash the Soviet defense and avenge Stalingrad. The Soviet command, fully aware of their plans, prepared thoroughly. A deeply echeloned defense was built, dense with anti-tank guns and minefields. And, of course, the best armored units were concentrated at the most dangerous sectors: elite guards tank armies, the first to receive those precious crates of subcaliber shells before the battle began. Picture the hell of Prokhorovka. Thousands of tanks clashing on a narrow strip of land, thunder, smoke, and fire. In that chaos, an ordinary T-34 could hardly stand against a Tiger. The German tank could hit a Soviet one from 1.5 to 2 kilometers away, while the T-34's gun was only effective within 500 meters. But the presence of subcaliber shells changed the entire tactic. Soviet crews exploited their tanks' main advantages: speed and maneuverability. They didn't engage in open duels at long range. They hid in folds of terrain, in groves, in ambushes, waiting until the German heavyweights came within killing distance. When a Tiger crept to 500 to 600 meters, they fired one single decisive shot, the spool shot. That first shot was often the German tank's last. For German crews, it was a total shock. They advanced confidently, believing themselves invincible, and suddenly their lead tanks erupted into flames one after another. It threw their formations into confusion, broke the attack's tempo. Of course, there were very few subcaliber shells. They couldn't destroy all German tanks, but their precise, surgical use at the most critical sectors blunted the enemy's offensive momentum. They became a small but vital cog in the vast mechanism of Soviet defense that ultimately turned the tide of the Kursk battle. Every Tiger destroyed by a BR-350P round meant more than just a burned-out machine. It meant dozens of Soviet lives saved, a position held, time won. The BR-350P's effectiveness at Kursk was so great that keeping it secret from the Germans was no longer possible. Sooner or later, they were bound to capture either a shell or a tank carrying them. And that day came. In one battle, the Germans captured an almost intact T-34 whose crew had been killed. Inside its ammunition racks, they found several strange spool-shaped rounds. The prize was immediately sent to Germany, to the Kummersdorf Proving Ground, the Wehrmacht's main weapons testing center. For German engineers, it was a revelation. They finally had the chance to study in detail the weapon that had caused them so much trouble. The shell was disassembled, its design examined, its core chemically analyzed. The results confirmed their suspicions. It was a subcaliber round with a tungsten carbide core. The Germans were impressed by the simplicity and effectiveness of the Soviet design. It was cruder and technologically simpler than their own Panzergranate 40, but it worked, and it worked well. They conducted test firings of the captured rounds against their own tanks. The results matched perfectly with what they had seen on the front. Reliable penetration of the Tiger's frontal armor at up to 500 m. The mystery was solved. The German command now knew exactly what it was facing. This had two major consequences. First, an order was issued to speed up work on increasing the armor thickness of new tanks. After Kursk, modified Panthers and King Tigers appeared with even heavier protection. The Germans tried once again to regain the lead by creating armor that even a tungsten core could not pierce. Second, the tactics of German tank crews changed. They were ordered not to let T-34s close to short range, to open fire from maximum distance, using the superior range and optics of their guns. Close-quarters duels became too dangerous. Thus, even after its secret was exposed, the BR-350P shell continued to work for the Soviet Union. It forced the enemy to spend resources on thicker armor, making their tanks heavier and less reliable, and it forced them to change tactics, depriving them of some of their advantages in close combat. After the partial disclosure of the secret, Soviet leadership faced a serious strategic question. What next? Should they remove the secrecy and begin mass production of subcaliber shells to arm the entire army? On the surface that seemed logical, but the State Defense Committee had strong reasons not to. The main problem remained the same: tungsten. There was catastrophically little of it. Calculations showed that even if all tungsten available in the USSR, including Lend-Lease supplies, were diverted to shell production, it would still be enough for only a very limited number of rounds. That, in turn, would halt production of cutting tools for machine manufacturing, effectively collapsing the entire military industry. It was an unaffordable luxury. Producing tanks and aircraft was more important than producing miracle shells. So a compromise, but very wise, decision was made. Production of BR-350P would continue, but it would remain strictly limited. The shell would retain its status as a special weapon for special missions. Instead of arming everyone with it, it would still be delivered only to elite guards units and the most critical sectors of the front. This was typical Soviet wartime strategy, pragmatic and asymmetric. Rather than trying to match and surpass Germany in the race of armor and calibers, costly and slow, the Soviet command bet on cheap, efficient solutions that could neutralize the enemy's technological superiority. Let's look at the numbers, recently declassified. Throughout 1943, about 100,000 subcaliber 76mm shells were produced. Sounds impressive, but compared to the tens of millions of regular shells made of that caliber, it was a drop in the ocean. On average, for every subcaliber shell, there were several hundred conventional armor-piercing or high-explosive rounds. These figures best illustrate how rare and valuable this weapon was. It was not a panacea, not a silver bullet, but a scalpel used skillfully and only when absolutely necessary. Despite its scarcity, the BR-350P was not the only subcaliber ammunition in the Red Army's arsenal. The success of the 76mm inspired engineers to develop similar shells for other artillery systems. One of the most famous was for the 57mm ZIS-2 anti-tank gun, a unique weapon with a very long barrel that gave its projectile tremendous muzzle velocity. Back in 1941, it had shown phenomenal armor-piercing power, but was considered excessively powerful and removed from production. In 1943, with the arrival of Tigers, it was brought back, and a special subcaliber round, BR-271P, was developed for it. This small but extremely fast shell was an even deadlier weapon than its older brother. It could penetrate a Tiger's armor from over a kilometer away. Anti-tank gun crews armed with ZIS-2s and subcaliber rounds became true Tiger hunters. They set ambushes along roads and on likely tank routes and could destroy a German vehicle with a single shot, often without being detected. Later, when the new T-34-85 entered service, equipped with a much more powerful 85mm gun, it too received its own subcaliber round, the BR-365P. It possessed even greater penetration power and allowed the new T-34 to confidently engage every type of German heavy tank, including even the King Tiger. Thus, the idea embodied in the BR-350P continued to evolve. Soviet engineers created an entire line of specialized munitions that allowed various artillery systems to fight enemy armor effectively until the very end of the war. This demonstrated how flexible and adaptive the Soviet engineering school was. It didn't cling to a single solution but constantly sought new approaches, creating diverse tools for victory. The story of subcaliber ammunition is vivid proof of that, from the little spool for the old T-34 gun to the powerful rounds for the guns of victory. It was a path of constant refinement and the search for optimal solutions amid the harshest war. Let's step away from the technical details and talk about the people. What psychological effect did the appearance of subcaliber shells have on tankers on both sides of the front? For the Soviet crew, as already mentioned, it was a tremendous moral boost. A tanker fighting in a 1942 model T-34 knew perfectly well that in an open duel with a Tiger he was essentially a doomed man. His weapon was ineffective, his armor vulnerable. That bred fatalism and sometimes passivity. But when 2 or 3 special shells appeared in his ammo racks, everything changed. He suddenly had a tool of retribution. He stopped being a victim and became a hunter. It changed the psychology of combat itself. The crew began to act more boldly, more cunningly, seeking ways to close in and deliver the decisive strike. Veteran tanker Dmitry Leza, hero of the Soviet Union, recalled that having subcaliber rounds gave confidence and allowed them to look at the German heavyweights without fear. For the Germans, the effect was the opposite. Until the summer of 1943, the crews of Tigers and Panthers felt on the battlefield as if inside medieval castles, protected by thick armor and able to shoot their enemies with impunity from long range. But when those castles began to be breached, and by weapons they had once despised, their confidence crumbled. A new, previously unknown factor of risk appeared. Every T-34 on the horizon was now a potential mortal threat. A German tanker could no longer be sure that the next Soviet shell to hit him would simply bounce off. What if it was that tungsten one? That question, constantly hanging in the air, created enormous nervous tension. It made them act more cautiously, look over their shoulders, avoid close contact. The legendary German tank ace Otto Carius wrote in his memoirs that Russian tankers, operating from ambush, had become extremely dangerous. Their shells burned through armor, leaving no chance. This fear of the unknown, the constant risk of instant death from a small but deadly round, became a major factor undermining the morale of elite German panzer divisions. The war of nerves was no less important than the war of armor. To better understand the uniqueness of the Soviet approach, let's compare the BR-350P with similar developments in other nations, Germany and the Allies. Yes, the subcaliber concept was not an exclusively Soviet invention. German engineers, as already mentioned, had developed their own Panzergranate 40. The British in 1944 created perhaps the most advanced subcaliber round of the Second World War, the APDS, armor-piercing discarding sabot. What was the difference? The German Panzergranate 40 was technologically sophisticated with excellent ballistics and high penetration, but it was complex to manufacture, and, crucially, the Germans faced the same problem as the Soviets: a severe tungsten shortage. Their miracle rounds were produced in very limited numbers and were mainly used by the Luftwaffe's anti-tank aircraft rather than as standard tank ammunition. The British APDS, on the other hand, was a true technological breakthrough. In its design, the sabot did not merely crumple on impact, it separated from the core immediately after leaving the barrel. This allowed the core to be even thinner and longer, shaped like a perfect aerodynamic dart. As a result, British 17-pounder guns firing these shells could penetrate Tiger and Panther armor from great distances. But they appeared on the battlefield quite late, in 1944, when the outcome of the war was already largely decided. And now, back to the Soviet BR-350P. It was simpler and rougher than the German equivalent, technologically inferior to the British one. Its effective range was shorter. Due to its non-discarding sabot, it lost velocity and accuracy faster at long range. But it had two key advantages. First, it appeared earlier. Already in early 1943, it was at the front, contributing to decisive battles like Kursk. Second, its design was maximally simplified and cheapened for limited wartime production. The Soviet Union was not chasing technological perfection. It sought a good enough solution that could be made here and now, a weapon that solved the practical problem of killing German armor. And in that pragmatic approach lay the genius of Soviet engineering thought. Not to build the perfect weapon in a lab, but to give the soldier a working tool on the battlefield. Perhaps not ideal, but capable of bringing victory. By late 1943 and early 1944, the role of the 76mm subcaliber shell began to decline, for several reasons. The main one was the arrival of a new tank, the legendary T-34-85. This machine was the answer to the appearance of Tigers and Panthers. Its most important feature was a new, larger turret fitted with a powerful 85mm gun. This weapon already possessed much better ballistic characteristics. Its standard full-caliber armor-piercing shell could penetrate the Panther's frontal armor and the Tiger's side armor at medium ranges. Thus, the urgent need for special subcaliber ammunition to fight heavy tanks largely disappeared. The main work could now be done by the standard, mass-produced shell. Of course, an 85mm subcaliber round was also developed, even more powerful, but it no longer played the same decisive, almost mystical role as its predecessor. It became just another type of ammunition in the loadout, not the crew's last hope. The second reason was that the Germans adapted. They already knew about the spool shells and changed their tactics, trying not to let Soviet tanks close to short range. Moreover, the armor of new German machines such as the King Tiger became even thicker, and even a tungsten core from the 76mm gun could no longer always cope with it. The era of the 76mm F-34 gun was coming to an end. It had served faithfully during the hardest years of the war, but new challenges demanded new, more powerful weapons. The BR-350P round became, in a way, the swan song of that legendary gun. It allowed it to fight on equal terms with an enemy that had seemed far superior, extending the combat life of thousands of T-34s and KV-1s. giving them the ability to play their part in victory at Kursk and in the later campaigns. But time moved forward, and new heroes replaced the old ones. The T-34-85, the Su-100, the ISU-152 with their monstrous firepower. The subcaliber shell for the F-34 had fulfilled its historical mission and gradually faded into the background, giving way to more advanced weapon systems. The war ended. The salutes of victory thundered, peaceful life began. And after it, the Cold War. And then something strange happened. About the subcaliber BR-350P shells, it was as if everyone simply forgot. In official war histories, in Marshall's memoirs, in films and books, they were almost never mentioned. All the glory went to the mass T-34, to the heroism of its crews, to the power of new tanks and self-propelled guns. The secret shell slipped back into the shadows. Why did that happen? There were several reasons. First, the secrecy stamp. It was not lifted immediately after the war. Tungsten remained a strategic material, and the technology of producing subcaliber rounds was still important amid the new confrontation with former allies. No one was eager to reveal those secrets. Second, the official propaganda line. Soviet historiography emphasized mass heroism and the superiority of the socialist system that could equip the army with vast quantities of machinery. The story that defeating German tanks required a small, secret weapon born from the limitations of standard guns didn't fit that narrative well. It was easier to say our armor is strong and our tanks are fast than to admit that sometimes that armor and those tanks needed a clever crutch, the subcaliber shell. Third, the veterans themselves. The few who had actually used this weapon were ordinary soldiers. For them, it was simply another tool of war, effective, yes, but just one among many. They didn't know the technical details or understand the strategic significance of the project. In their memoirs, they preferred to write about comradeship, fear and courage, daily life at the front, not about the types of shells in their racks. And so, this unique story of a technological breakthrough and an asymmetric response to an existential threat was buried in classified archives for decades. The public knew about Katyusha rockets, about Il-2 Sturmovix, about T-34s, but the little spool that could pierce a tiger remained unknown to almost everyone. It became one of the many blank spots in the history of the Great Patriotic War. Decades passed. The Soviet Union collapsed. The era of glasnost began. The once sealed archives slowly began to reveal their secrets. And in the 1990s and early 2000s, historians working with Defense Ministry documents began to stumble upon strange folders marked Top Secret, Special Importance. Inside them contained test reports, production summaries, and orders for the delivery to the troops of a certain shell, the BR-350P. At first, no one paid much attention to it. But when researchers began to cross-reference these documents with German loss reports and veterans' memoirs, the picture started to come together. A whole hidden story began to emerge, one that no one had suspected before. Historians and military technology enthusiasts worked like detectives, piecing together fragments of information. They found orders from Guards tank armies authorizing the issue of special ammunition. They found combat reports in which commanders noted the successful use of these rounds against Tigers. They found German documents in which engineers analyzed captured spool shells. The puzzle was assembling. It turned out that the rumors about the miracle shell that circulated among frontline soldiers were not just campfire tales. Behind them stood a real, large-scale, and top-secret state program. This discovery was akin to finding a lost city. It forced historians to reconsider many seemingly well-known episodes of the war, especially the Battle of Kursk. It became clear that the Soviet victory there was due not only to mass heroism and the number of tanks, but also to this secret trump card. It was a genuine historical revelation, one that filled one of the most intriguing gaps in the history of World War II armored warfare. The mystery of the forbidden shell, guarded so carefully for over half a century, finally unveiled. What is the significance of this story today? Why is the tale of a small piece of tungsten so important for understanding the entire war? Because this discovery forces us to rethink the old stereotype that the Soviet Union won purely through numbers, not skill, that it simply buried the enemy under corpses and overwhelmed him with sheer mass. The story of the BR-350P proves otherwise. It shows the remarkable level of Soviet scientific and engineering thought, which, under the harshest wartime conditions, found an elegant, asymmetric solution to a seemingly insurmountable technical problem. It's a story of flexibility and pragmatism. Instead of joining a costly, time-consuming race of calibers and armor, the Soviet leadership bet on a focused, high-technology response that equalized the odds on the battlefield. It's a story of how a nation can defeat a technologically superior enemy through intellect, creativity, and unconventional thinking. It also adds an important new perspective to the eternal debate, T-34 versus Tiger. People often say that the T-34 was weaker. And yes, in a direct one-on-one duel, the Tiger was stronger. But war is not a nightly tournament. The story of the subcaliber shell shows that the T-34 crew had a hidden ace in that contest. It explains many cases that once seemed mysterious, when ordinary T-34s emerged victorious against German cats. Now we know that, in some of those duels, inside the T-34's gun lay that very forbidden shell. This is a story of ingenuity and resourcefulness, a reminder that even in a total war, where brute force seems to decide everything, there is always room for an intelligent, cunning solution that can change the outcome of a battle, and sometimes of history itself. So, let's sum it up. The story of the BR-350P subcaliber shell is much more than the tale of a new type of ammunition. It's a multifaceted saga where science, secrecy, industry, and heroism are woven together. A story of how, faced with the rise of German steel monsters, the Tigers and Panthers, Soviet engineers, working in conditions of absolute secrecy and extreme resource shortages, created a weapon that was both simple and brilliant. It was a weapon that gave the aging gun of the T-34 a second life and allowed it to fight on equal terms with the elite of Hitler's Panzerwaffe. It was also a story of strategic wisdom, not flooding the front with miracle weapons, but using them like a surgeon's scalpel precisely and where they mattered most, turning them into the special forces of the ammunition world. Few in number, secret, but deadly effective. It became a legend long before the world learned of its existence. It gave confidence to Soviet tankers and sowed fear and uncertainty in the ranks of the enemy. It was one of those small yet crucial factors that helped the Red Army hold firm and ultimately prevail in the titanic struggle at Kursk. And finally, it is a story of a secret kept for more than 50 years. A secret revealed only thanks to the painstaking work of historians combing through declassified archives. It reminds us that behind every great event and famous name stand thousands of unseen acts of courage, not only by soldiers, but by engineers, scientists, and designers. The story of BR-350P is a monument to those anonymous geniuses of wartime science, who, in the quiet of their workshops and laboratories, forged the weapons of victory, weapons that, though few in number, left a deep and lasting mark on the history of humanity's greatest war.